Welcome everybody to Neutrality Studies and to Pulsi with Michael Rossi and to a show with Nicolai Petro. And there's gonna be two more guests on today's live broadcast. We are, as of now, still waiting for Professor Glenn Diesen, and we're waiting for Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who will certainly join us. But instead of letting you wait, I think it makes sense to use the time that we've got. And I would like to welcome my first two guests. So Michael Rossi from the beautiful YouTube channel Michael Rossi Pulsi, and Nicolai Petro from the University of Rhode Island. Both of them professors for political science. Both of you, welcome.
Thank you, Pascal. Good to see you once again.
We are meeting today actually on the very sad occasion that this week was the 4th anniversary of the beginning of the special military operation, of the all-out large-scale war between Russia-Ukraine, between Russia and NATO, the proxy war, as most of us understand it. And I would like to maybe start with you, Nicolai, just to get your assessment now. I mean, if you compare, because you wrote this book, you wrote a very important book, the Tragedy of Ukraine, and if you compare the first, the beginning of the war and how you perceived also the shock that it started, because you too we were all surprised that it came to this. What do you think we have learned in these 4 years that just at the very beginning was kind of unthinkable or not on our radars?
I think, well, the world in general has become a grubbier, nastier place, I think. And the war in Ukraine has given ample space for people to vent their deep-seated dislike of others and to elevate those aspects of international relations that are always there, and not just international relations, I suppose politics in general, that aspect that Hobbes referred to as nasty and brutish. And then he added short as well when talking about life. But let's hope we can avoid at least the latter part. But it's turning into that triad more and more. When one listens to the rhetoric of certain political leaders, and I must say, comparing the political rhetoric of the major actors in this conflict, so Ukrainians, European leaders, Russian leaders, and the United States, the nastiest and most bellicose of all at this point seem to be the Europeans who cannot let go of the desire for war, even if it means that peace is delayed indefinitely. In other words, they want to have it both ways. They say, well, we want peace, of course, but actually they don't, because in the very next phrase they say, but not this peace. We cannot have a peace that is unjust. Well, truth be told, every peace is seen as unjust by the other side, the losing side. And that is something that they have to come to terms with. And the extent to which they do determines whether this is just the end of conflict for a lengthy duration, or merely a respite from these woes.
Michael, why do you think that is this complete kind of reversal of where we thought that Europe stands in terms of war and peace? That it is really Europe that the US must avoid actually the Europeans in these discussions in order to get anywhere, and the Europe actually having the back of Ukraine in order to make sure that they can keep on fighting. Where do
Yeah.
you think it's coming from now? I mean, 4 years is a long time, and somehow also my perception has changed on them quite drastically.
So I'll begin by saying that, and I was thinking, how am I going to open up my own comments about the 4-year anniversary? And I remember I did a video on the first year anniversary of the war, and I started out by saying that a year into this, what do we know? The first is that Russia is not losing this battle. Ukraine is not winning. So it looks like it is not becoming a stalemate, but it looks like this is not going to be as easy for the West to dislodge Russia from Ukraine, that Russia will not get bogged down in its own self-imposed quagmire, and that Ukraine will survive in perpetuity every 2 weeks, every time the West gives them more ammunition, more money, more funding, and more diplomatic support for a future. Fast forward to 3 years later, and we are exactly where we were on that first year anniversary. Once again, Russia is not losing. In fact, at this point, Russia seems to be gaining leverage. They have not lost any significant territorial gains in Ukraine since that. I don't even know if we can even call that first maneuver by the Ukrainian forces as a counteroffensive. The much vaunted counteroffensive in July of 2023 proved to be much ado about nothing. But a year before that, Russia had had withdrawn from lots of territory in Ukraine's north, around the Kharkov area. They had withdrawn from the city of Kherson, and this was widely seen. And here is where I'm addressing this question of yours, Pascal, because it looked like Russia had bit off more than it could chew, and that it was about to reel under its own weight. So why is it that Europe now, 3 years later, is playing hardball? Why are they the most intractable in finding a solution? And I think the answer to this is the establishment of embedded and entrenched narratives that through the media, through diplomatic communiques, through official statements, Europe is positioned itself as the bastion of democracy. They are defending Ukraine's territorial integrity and their desire to join the ranks of states and societies in the West, NATO and the European Union. When you make these statements, it is very difficult to back out of. It is very difficult to admit that you might have been wrong. It is difficult to acknowledge that your fight in this is not going according to plan. And so you stick to your rhetoric. And we've been hearing over the past couple of weeks now statements from Paul Stubb, from Kaja Kallas, from Ursula von der Leyen, from a number of other foreign ministers and officials from states that Russia is losing, right? This has been a disaster for Vladimir Putin, despite the fact that Russia continues to gain ground in Ukraine's east and south, albeit very, very slow. But the thing is that they have not withdrawn. It's a slog. And the big question is whether this is because this is what Russia is capable of doing, or whether this is deliberately done to grind down Ukraine's defenses. And we have seen this time and again, whether it's Bakhmut, Pokrovsk, Zaporozhye. Is this really a way of just slowly burning through Ukraine's defenses, as well as making it look like it's an exercise in futility from the West to continue dumping money into Ukraine? In which case, public resentment, especially at the ballot box, has started to ask, Why are we sacrificing so much for another country at our own expense? Why are we compromising our own security to effectively give all of our arms and armaments to Ukraine? Why are we forced to cut back on energy consumption so we give it to Ukraine? And this is, in a way, fueling, I don't know how successful this is going to be, but it is fueling the skeptics, the war skeptics that largely are voiced on the political right, the populist right. And whether or not this produces an electoral changeover in countries like Germany or France, we noticed in the last few weeks, I think this was the presidential election in the Czech Republic. Babiš had come to power. He is also a populist. He shares the same sentiments as Orban and Fico, who, by the way, are regarded as the dissenters, right, as the pro-Russian agents within the EU, despite the fact that they are speaking out ultimately for their own constituents and their own national interests. So I guess the reason why Europe, in my opinion, is still sticking to its guns and making proclamations about what Russia has to do in order to achieve peace, which we know is not going to happen. They don't have the leverage. And I'm not exactly sure if they think that, one more fusion of money or weapons is going to all of a sudden galvanize Ukraine to push the Russian forces back. My guess is that this is really digging in one's heels and admitting that they would rather drag this out than admit that their prognosis of both the war and of Russia were wrong.
Nicolai, you've also you've studied the sources coming out from both sides, right? And Michael mentioned these entrenched narratives. Do you think that the war also had that effect on Russia, that it entrenched the Russian narrative of the war and
Sure.
on Ukraine? Like, I mean, the losing side is usually the one who has its narrative somehow scratched and destroyed. And I mean, I always compare it to what happened to Japan, right? Once it was beaten, I mean, it had to completely reinvent itself, right, within the span of just a few years. But what do you see that these 4 years did to the narrative in Russia, to the narrative in Ukraine? And well, I think Europe is what Michael said, just an entrenched, like bizarre version of this military reality.
Yeah, in all three venues, Europe, Ukraine, and Russia, the narrative hasn't settled yet because it is not yet the post-war.
Right.
And the governments that would be capable of imposing a narrative are not yet in place. So what we have now is the wartime narrative. And it is always been, under all circumstances, be it World War I, World War II, other subsequent wars, it's always subject to revision afterwards. So in the case of what's happening now in Russia is that the elite positions have hardened. My sense is that there is a much clearer understanding and acceptance that the West is the enemy, or not the West as a cultural concept. I think Russian officials, by and large, have tried to make that distinction. But the current political elite in the West has embraced, and this is absolutely true, the narrative of strategic defeat of Russia. So their plans have faltered, and it turns out even many of Putin's, I wouldn't call them enemies, but I would say people who were skeptical of the Putin regime and would like to see it transition to the next phase, next leadership after Putin, have by and large, many of them come over to the view that Putin was right, since identifying in 2007 in his Munich Security Conference speech, that the West the United States in particular, does not need allies. He said it needs vassals. And that has certainly come to be true, seen to be true now. And after the initial shock at how forcefully the Europeans and the United States in particular, that was less of a surprise, but the Europeans decided to engage in this sort of support for Ukraine and anti-Russian activities, specifically the sanctions regime, which is a novelty in its extremity in international relations. That after that, they're more willing to give Putin leeway in his interpretations than they were before. And of course, part of that is what is left of the Russian elite after the self-imposed exile. So the leave taking of many pop stars and cultural icons after the first, I would say, six to 9 months. Now, it is also true that some of them have returned and saying, well, you know, we've come to see the West as it is, and they're not waiting for us here. Popular Russian phrase, you know, they're not looking forward to having us here. So actually, yeah, life is better at home, and so many of them have returned. Many IT specialists and things like that were meant to have a longer term impact. That impact has not proven to be as dramatic. So in Russia, the sentiment is, I think, very wary of the West. And I think one of the things to expect after the war is a reluctance on the part of Russian elites to re-embrace the Western economic model, to sort of say, okay, yeah, come in and invest your money, or, you know, share your technologies and things like that. It will be well understood for quite a while that the West does not have, in these kind of commercial dealings, primarily commercial interests in mind, but an effort to exert political leverage to the detriment of Russia. And that's a lesson that was hard learned, I would say, in Russia, but I think is there to stay now.
So in a sense, this is the inevitable pathway into this multipolar world order, where the Russians and the Chinese, but the Iranians too, are going to cooperate but not integrate.
The Indians,
the Indians too, and are not going to trust this anymore. I mean, it is now very, very evident that a lot of the integration talk and the fluffy rhetoric is very much set up as a trap.
And Michael Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, said the taboo part out loud. And it's since been reiterated by a number of other Western leaders. And remember, we were talking about the lessons that Russia learned. Russia has learned these lessons for itself, but the wise leaders of other countries see the implications for themselves as well. So this is an international lesson that has done a great deal to promote the prospects and the anticipation of what a multipolar order might look like. And that's something that sadly is not discussed enough in the West, to its own detriment. It's not looking to understand that process. It's kind of burying its head in the sand, I think, too many Western leaders, not us, of course, analysts.
Well, we are not leaders.
Leaders or and well, so But I think there are already some very interesting concepts and approaches to try to define what multipolarity means and how it could become a reality in the governance of international relations that are already being discussed in other places outside the traditional West.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a very sad sense, we must say that the blood of these hundreds of thousands, if not million, of dead soldiers on both sides and dead civilians, that blood kind of bought us clarity that there wasn't before, about not only about the distribution of strength and the realities of modern warfare, but also about the way these different parts of the world actually approach international relations. Michael, do you think, because you're traveling quite a lot also in Central Asia,
Sure.
what do you think is the lesson that is being taken away there? Because, like, okay, it's not Central Asia, but if you look at the Caucasus, we have like very conflicting kind of approach now, with Georgia trying to be the most neutral of the three Southern Caucasus states, Azerbaijan basically hugging Israel and the United States, and Armenia, I don't know, doing something that looked like digging its own grave. But
Armenia is doing
where do you
something.
think where do you think the former Soviet republics are taking this?
Well, I was in Uzbekistan when the war started. I was just there a little bit more than a month. And the Uzbek government issued, to my knowledge, its one and only statement about the war. And it was very predictable. And that was, we recognize what is happening between Russia and Ukraine. We are not getting involved. We will neither condone nor will we condemn. Our business with Russia is our own. We are not going to interfere at all. And this was the predictable response. All of my colleagues there were expecting this statement from President Shavkat Mirziyoyev, because Uzbekistan, like Central Asia, is tied very closely, economically, infrastructurally, labor-wise also, with Russia. So if there is any thought of Central Asia untethering itself from its longtime partnership with Russia, it is years, if not decades away. And that's not going to really happen, because on one level, as Central Asia is opening up, and here's what I'm specifically talking about: Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Kazakhstan is taking the lead in promoting itself as a so-called middle power, a country that is based on neutrality, although all Central Asian states position themselves in some form of neutrality. I think the most extreme form is Turkmenistan, which is just a nice way of saying isolation. And that's fine, because there's very few countries that are eager to do business with Turkmenistan. Russia is certainly one. China, is another. But on the opposite end of that spectrum, when we look at Kazakhstan, that wants to work with any country willing to work with it. And during my time there, I was surprised to find that one of the biggest trading partners of Kazakhstan, if you can believe this, is Italy, of all countries, right? Not Russia, not China, right? But Italy. So it's Kazakhstan has been engaging, especially under the current president, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, in, I would say, sort of low-level soft power diplomacy that has been saying, without actually saying it, we are both looking to the West, we are retaining our strategic partnerships with the former Soviet sphere, and we are also receptive to investment from the East. And I think this is, Central Asia is going to be very different from that of the Caucasus for a couple of reasons. One, Central Asia has, nobody in the EU or NATO is thinking about expanding that far. If we get to that point, we have really crossed a Rubicon that the three of us, haven't yet seen. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why there is much more of this tug and pull between the East and the West, with Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. And as far as Azerbaijan is concerned, sure, they're cuddling up to Israel. There was a spat a year ago with between Azerbaijan and Russia. Apparently, there were a series of arrests and one or two murders of Azerbaijani citizens that were, by Russia's acknowledgement, engaged in some criminal activities or what have you. And this led to a freezing, a very cooling of relations for a couple of weeks. But Aliyev and Putin get along quite well when they're in the same room. So, Azerbaijan is playing all sides as well. Georgia, I have been to Tbilisi twice, and I can tell you that the big paradox of Tbilisi is all of the pro-Western, anti-Russian graffiti on the walls, right, at a cafe, in which who is sitting right in front of this anti-Russian graffiti, but Russian tourists who are speaking Russian. The waiter comes by, speaks to them in Russian. It's almost as if the movement that had galvanized Georgia towards considering more alliance partnerships with the West. And this is especially true when we consider, I think it was at the Bucharest summit of 2008, if I'm not mistaken, where the door was open for the possibility for NATO's future membership for Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which has led to sort of the cleavage, the political cleavages within these countries. Georgia, I think the moment has passed. I'm not saying that it is now gone. We have a government in Tbilisi that is now quite pro-Moscow. But the biggest problem for many Georgians isn't that the government is pro-Moscow, but that it's pro-Moscow while Russia continues to control two disputed territories within Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. So the territorial issue, more than anything else, is what drives a lot of this sentiment in Georgia towards the West and against Russia. When it comes to Armenia, I'm kind of at a loss for how it is that Pashinyan has not been removed from power just yet. He seems to be declaring war on everyone, from his political opponents to the Armenian Apostolic Church. And yet, he remains in power after the debacle in Nagorno-Karabakh, handing over the Zanigor corridor in the southern part of the country to a consortium that is closely connected to Donald Trump, which effectively now links Azerbaijan with its exclave, Nakhchivan. Appears, and the one thing that I think keeps him somehow moving is that in all of this, there is some talk of a rapprochement with Azerbaijan, although there has been no talk at all about the status of Karabakh, if there's going to be anything, left at all. Will the Armenians be able to return? And then, the opening up of relations, the opening up of the border with Turkey, which we see as a, potential boom for the economy. But when it comes to Central Asia, and I'll finish this up quickly, is that Central Asia is too far away from the West to make that much of a difference. And my time there is that, yes, the West and the United States have a presence, but it's really a tertiary presence. It's one that comes at best after Russia's continued presence within the region and China's encroaching influence within that region. So a lot of what we get from the West is cosmetic and deals mostly with universities in capital cities or tourism in second cities.
May I ask you, Nicolai, at the beginning of the war in 2022, the first one on my channel, whoever called this a proxy war, I think, if I remember correctly, was the former European Parliament member Claire Daly. She framed it very early, I think, in April as a proxy war. And back then, when you used the word proxy war, you were immediately accused of being Russia friendly, and of course NATO has nothing to do with it. NATO is out of the question. I mean, it's the West that's now rallying together in the hour of need of Ukraine, and it's coming up with ingenious emergency measures to support Ukraine against this invasion. I think 4 years by now have taught us that narrative too is pretty much out of the window, right? And the proxy war characteristic of this confrontation between Russia and NATO is more or less accepted. I mean, including 2 New York Times articles, which in very great detail explain how the CIA had been involved in building up these forward bases and intelligence hubs, plus the entire intelligence that's being gathered by NATO, and then down to the targeting of NATO weaponry in Ukraine on Russia, right? Where do you think that we stand with this one? Is the proxy war element of this confrontation by now universally understood or accepted, or where do we stand?
It should be. I think the dam was broken when Secretary of State Marco Rubio used that very phrase.
Right. Last year, a year ago. Yeah.
But it's still a fig leaf. I mean, what we have is a European war against Russia. It is allied with Ukraine. And if you frame the discussion from the perspective of what Ukraine wants, then European leaders do step up and say, well, we're allies, we are helping, we are doing everything we can, we will stand by you for as long as it takes. But if you then shift and ask, well, exactly what is our policy toward Ukraine within the context of press meetings in Europe, then you get all sorts of uncertainties and caveats and things like that. So it's only a proxy war to the extent that current European governments do not openly acknowledge the extent to which they are themselves engaged in this war effort. And as you point out correctly, guiding it, supporting, without European assistance, the war effort in Ukraine, I think, would collapse, because we are literally talking about half of the current accounts budget of the Ukrainian government being funded externally, and half of its military supplies being funded externally. So if we, as many analysts consider the situation of the Ukrainian military and economy dire as it is now, with the relatively meager rations that are afforded it in order to continue the war effort, ending this sort of support would quickly lead to a negotiated settlement, I think. Mm-hmm. But there's one thing that hasn't been talked about yet, and I thought is probably worth throwing into the mix when it comes to asking, why are Europeans so committed to victory, or at least to the rhetoric of victory in order to continue the war effort? And that is because a number of economists have pointed out they economically are increasingly dependent on this war. In other words, they are committing themselves financially, and in terms of their budgets, to vast increases in industrial military spending through the end of this decade. And in order to see that through, the sense of urgency has to be maintained. The sense of an immediate threat has to be maintained. Because if there's anything that we have seen through European history, that is that once the fighting is over, it is very difficult to support increased military spending. People want to return to a normal civilian life, and all of the restrictions that have been imposed will have to be at least eased, if not lifted. Once they're eased and lifted, the narrative of Russia as an imminent threat becomes more difficult to maintain, even more difficult to maintain. And as a result, it's not in the interests of the current European leadership to do that. Secondly, they are on the hook for a huge financial indebtedness. They have said that they will support the reconstruction of Ukraine to the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. That will not come to pass. At best, the hope is that the money seized, that is currently sequestered in Europe, the Russian sovereign assets that are currently sequestered in Europe, will then be expropriated by Europe and used to finance Ukraine. That does not appear likely at present. It may be part of the negotiations that lead to a ceasefire, but without Russia's acquiescence, there is no financial mechanism whereby the EU could fulfill its promise to help fund the restoration, the economic rebuilding and restoration of Ukraine. And therefore, what the war allows the current European leadership to do is fulfill or receive financial, popular support in order to build up its military and rebuild its industrial base. Gives a rationale for that. Meanwhile, putting off indefinitely the prospect of having to spend money that it doesn't have to reconstruct Ukraine. And financially, I would say the EU is in much more of a bind, example, than Russia is. I was struck by a phrase in one of Ben Arris's piece. He's a Berlin-based editor of Business New Europe, where he says, given current budgetary constraints, France and I think he said France and Britain are closer to financial collapse than Russia is today.
What does that? Where does that leave us, or where does that leave the ability of Europe to turn around? One of my fears, Michael and Nicolai, is that the sanctions regime, which actually really is unprecedented. I mean, it started in 2014, but it was expanded and it was set on kind of an independent footing, on an independent legal footing. That regime, even if tomorrow the weapons fall silent and there is some form of a ceasefire and an arrangement, that those sanctions wouldn't go away, because Russia as an enemy by now has become kind of an essential component of the way that Europe seems to understand its own position in the whatever the greater project is. I mean, I still think the greater project is under U.S. leadership, but that Europe needs that enemy in the East. And Michael, how do you see it? And
there's a number of ways to approach. First of all, I think I can state, and you two can agree with me with this or not, but I honestly don't see the prospects for a ceasefire anytime soon. I don't see a breakthrough in any negotiated settlement for a couple of reasons. First of all, neither side has enough leverage to then force the other one into an agreement. Like you remember within the outbreak of the conflict 4 years ago, within a week or two, there was talk by the Ukrainians and the Russians to meet in Istanbul.
Yeah.
And it looked like, okay, this is basically it. Russia has achieved its goal. It's going to force Ukraine to relinquish any future prospects of joining NATO, will go militarily neutral, and that's going to be the end of it. And then, as the narrative goes, and as both Putin and Lavrov will always mention, the talks were scuttled, primarily by then Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Was he Prime Minister or not? But Boris Johnson steps in and basically tells the Ukrainians, don't worry about any of this. We've got your back. We will continue to fund you and keep you alive for every 2 weeks. And so here we are 4 years later. Knowing the position that Europe has for ending this conflict, which is making demands that cannot or will not be met by Russia, because Russia is right now, it has the tactical advantage on the proverbial battlefield. I think that this talk about negotiated settlements is largely that. If nothing else, to show one's audience at home that we are trying to end this conflict. And if it doesn't end, it's the other side's fault.
Right.
Take a look at what's happening with the ongoing talks between the United States and Iran, where if you are any official within Iran, for a fact the United States is not a neutral arbiter in this at all. Many are now speculating that the United States is deliberately making these talks impossible for Iran to agree with, so then they can turn around and say, well, talks have failed, and this either gives Israel the green light to strike, or Trump will launch some missiles and what have you. The other thing is, as Nicolai mentioned, right? Who was it? A few days ago, Kaja Kallas had said that even after the war, yes, sanctions will remain, and Russians will, especially Russian soldiers, will be banned from entering Europe. Right. So there is still this, for lack of better word, a very embedded element of Rousophobia. And I wish that Glenn were here to talk about this. He's the reigning expert on this idea of Rousophobia. I hesitate to use that word because oftentimes people can turn that around and say, well, take a look at what Russia has done. They have invaded a country. They have annexed territory. Rousophobia is just something that you say when you don't have anything else to say. But knowing the way in which Europe had positioned itself as the antithesis of Russia from as early as the 2007 Munich crisis, you're absolutely right. I don't see any sense of collective coming together anytime after this. And what we also see from the European side is that they are constantly pushing for security guarantees for Ukraine.
Right.
Security guarantees for Ukraine. No one, and I remember Jeff Sachs talking about this not that long ago, nobody considers security guarantees for Russia. And this is, according to Russia's side, the reason for the deterioration in the region leading up to, starting from 2014 all the way up to the end of 2021, a security dilemma was deliberately exacerbated by NATO. When NATO officials effectively say our expansion is not and should not be taken by Russia as a threat. However, if Russia sees it as a threat, at the same time, as a threat.
Michael, you're breaking up a bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nicolai, you're still there, right? Yeah, I hear you.
I am. While that catches up, I had a different take on the ceasefire. So please. Am more optimistic about a ceasefire.
Okay.
And the reason being that instead of viewing it, I draw a sharper distinction perhaps between the ceasefire component and the subsequent elements of the negotiation leading up to a settlement. So I say ceasefire, if successful, leads to armistice. Armistice, if successful, leads to a peace treaty. Peace treaty leads to a long-term settlement. And each of those takes takes a long time. So the peace process will take decades, of which, however, the first step is an important one. So ceasefire, I think my optimism is rooted in the same source as Mike's pessimism, namely Europe. So I see that Europe is the deal breaker.
Yeah.
But if you left, if somehow, and they could, in fact, get together on their own, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators, and even during these last several rounds of negotiations, it is striking how often the Ukrainian interlocutors will speak well of their Russian counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
And once, I think it was in either Axios or Politico, had a surprising comment, a comment of a surprised Western observers who said, it's like, they've just been out to a sports match and are getting back, and talking to each other and kind of reminiscing and things like that. We didn't expect that kind of intuitive understanding of each other's needs, and I think there is that. Mm-hmm. Still there among the older generation, who are now, in fact, still largely the senior diplomats in both countries. So I think if Europe were either got itself out of the way of peace, or were ignored in the way that the United States has put Europe in its place. If Ukraine could show the same sense of sovereignty and put Europe in its place and say, no, we will decide what we want to decide, even if it's not in your interests. Instead of voicing this as backroom grumblings and frustrations about Europeans being willing to spend money to the death of the last Ukrainian, instead of saying that behind closed doors, actually saying it out loud and in the open, that would, I think, change the equation for the better. That's one point. The second point is that Russia's stated objectives to date, and we know that those can change if prior conditions are not met, but stated objectives are the territorial security of the 4 oblasts and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. So once Russia reaches those borders, its only strategic objective remains securing the peace. And the rest is speculation. In other words, we don't know how long that will take. We don't know what cost that will take. That's all the military aspect of this. But in terms of what we can identify as Russia's stated strategy, it is that once those oblasts are secured, the borders are reached, Putin has even said, if there is a voluntary withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces, a ceasefire will be implemented the next day, at least from Russia's side.
Yeah. Because
we have achieved our objectives.
Yeah.
And so that's a target, I think. That it should be well understood that for Russia, that is the target. And it is a target within the ambit of a ceasefire strategy and negotiations.
And Michael, you got cut off there a little bit. I'm sorry, Nicolai took over, but
that's fine. No, I'm fine. Somebody in the comment section said that I sounded like Megatron for a moment. There's good Gen X pop cultural reference there. So that was, I'm sorry, a little glitch on my end. So, I mean, what I was effectively saying beforehand is, the prospects for a ceasefire, the prospects for a negotiated solution, I think, are very, very far off, because NATO and the EU are still coming from this assumption that they are in a position to bargain. And Russia, and I think this is one of the reasons why Russia tends to be more open and more willing to work with the United States. You and I just had this small talk before we went live about this, right? Where Russia, whether it's Putin or Lavrov, they speak highly of Steve Witkoff. They speak highly of Trump and Rubio. I don't know what they really think about them behind the scenes, knowing what they say as far as the future way of dividing up the world in, kidnapping a head of state in Venezuela, blockading Cuba, threatening to bomb Iran because it is doing, Netanyahu's work, what have you. So, they'll look at the United States and they will say that, the U.S. is one of the biggest causes of global instability. Putin, in his announcement when the special military operation began 4 years ago, referred to the United States as an empire of lies. I remember him saying this, an empire of lies. And this was predicated on the long list of agreements that was reached with the United States that the U.S. either did not implement or just simply scrapped as soon as the negotiations were over. And I think this is largely indicative of what the Istanbul Convention, what the Istanbul meetings were in 2022. But because we have an administration in Washington now, compromised as much as it is, willing to end the conflict in Ukraine and apparently give Russia much of what it wants. Russia seems to be playing this as a way of dividing, right, the United States from Europe, to which Europe just sounds increasingly naive, irrelevant, shouting from the rafters. And when we, and it certainly doesn't help when some of the most belligerent voices are coming from the Baltic states, which can obviously enjoy the security of Article 5 of NATO, but by themselves are considered to be little side dishes, as far as Russia is concerned. I think another thing that comes into this is I've heard people say this. The way in which Europe has this imbalance between understanding Russia, it's like Schrodinger's Russia. Russia is either on the brink of economic collapse. The army has engaged in severe cases of low morale. You might remember in the beginning of the conflict, Ursula von der Leyen was saying that Russian soldiers were stealing washing machines to use them for replaceable parts for their tanks. And yet at the same time, a country that Europe has effectively billed as a sideshow, cue the Benny Hill theme alongside of it, is poised to invade Europe. Next week, right? It's supposed to invade Europe. Like as soon as they're done with Ukraine, first of all, they will say Russia has failed to achieve its objectives in Ukraine. They're bogged down in the east. They can't even, take cities without major casualties. The Ukrainians are standing up and showing us how weak Russia really is. But we need to arm ourselves to the teeth. We need nuclear weapons. We need to safeguard ourselves from World War III. So you have to pick which one. Is Russia the country that is ready to just completely cripple Ukraine and then subjugate all of Europe? Or is Russia this paper tiger that does not need any of this attention? However, and I will finish out by this, is knowing that NATO's stockpiles have been depleted, and a lot of them are old Cold War, munitions and whatever. I'm wondering whether this is a way for Europe to get rid of its surplus, outdated hand-me-downs. Finish it out in Ukraine. I'm beginning to really wonder if Ukraine is just really the dress rehearsal for a larger conflict that, if the United States takes the lead, will do something to isolate, subjugate. We talk of balkanizing Russia, weakening it, dividing it up. If there is going to be a wider war between Russia and Europe, It is going to be started by Europe. It will not be started by Russia.
I I really hope not. But you know what is also so horrible about this entire rhetoric is, of course, that not only are we asked to believe two contradicting statements at the same time, as you just laid out. We are also supposed to believe that the Europeans are doing everything in their power, and they would have already intervened a long time ago if it wasn't for these weird contractual constraints of the NATO treaty. But the at any point in time, the Germans, the French, the British could have given security guarantees. They could at any point in time have joined the fray, right? But they didn't. NATO could have joined, but they didn't. NATO could have sent troops, but they didn't. Nicolai, just why? How long do you think can the general public in Ukraine still be sold the idea that these are their friends? I mean, I think it was you who once on my show said that once all is done and over, Ukrainians are going to be very, very mad with the Europeans and with NATO for for doing this so long to them and fighting to the last Ukrainian, right? How long do you think it can still go on before the ultra right wing nationalists start saying, "Wait a second, we can't survive this. This must stop"?
As long as Europe offers some form of assistance, the powers that be in Ukraine will take it. What they explain to their own populations is often very different from the kind of rhetoric that they engage in with the West. So it's very much in the West, it's like, thank you, and we're very appreciative. At home, of course, they say this is something that they have to do, that they are supporting us all the way. There is the combination of narrative control that is exercised by the West and Ukraine, and within Ukraine, on dissident voices, combined with the rules that prohibit demonstrations, mass demonstrations, under martial law, form a very tight level of control over social unrest. Now, we see the people acting out in frustration at the targets that are within their reach. And anyone who follows Ukrainian news sources, many of them outside of Ukraine now, will see the videos of the attacks now on the recruitment centers.
Right.
And the public gatherings, the way they've organized, I don't know, spontaneously or not, but even the head of the territorial recruitment centers say that getting people on the streets, seizing them, and forcing them to go into the military is a battle. It's about each incident now is a conflict with everyone around them. And even Zelensky has pointed out that bussification is a problem that we have to deal with. So that information still gets around, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And we do have the fact that people in Ukraine understand, and have taken the view, by and large, that Russia invaded. Russia invaded for its own reasons, not for the benefit of Ukraine. Maybe for the eastern regions, but not for the benefit of all Ukraine. And I think they accept that, and it's going to be a very difficult to overcome that in coming decades.
Mm-hmm.
we are nearing the 1 hour mark, and I think since we're a smaller group than expected, I would suggest that maybe both of you, if you have one more thought, that you believe is essential now after these 4 years, either looking back or looking forward, how you see this development now going, then please do share it with us, and take it anywhere you want, and maybe Michael first and then Nicolai.
Sure. So, in this conversation that we've had, this fantastic conversation that's been, here for a little, we just passed the hour mark now. I reiterate that I don't think that we are going to reach any negotiated settlement anytime soon, wherever they are located, whether it's in the Emirates or in Geneva or Istanbul, wherever. If there are any kind of talks outside of the battlefield, it's going to be between Russia and the United States, Ukraine and Europe. I don't see any convergence. I don't see any meeting of the of both sides, unless it is exchanging prisoners and dead soldiers. But other than that, one of the big issues that, at least as far as Ukraine has legitimacy in stalling, is very much this territorial issue. That's ultimately what it is. I question what was Russia's intention in February 4 years ago in recognizing the independence of Donbass, because that automatically questions, that violates another country's territorial integrity. Ukraine had already lost Crimea in 2014, but Europe was willing to allow that to happen very much unofficially. I mean, the sanctions that had been placed on Russia after the Crimean annexation were ready to run out, right? Europe was effectively saying, if Russia does not make any further gains, any further encroaches in Ukraine, we might be able to come to some meeting of the mind. This is the one thing that galvanized the hardliners in Ukraine, because once a piece of territory is taken, there is no room for negotiation. And this has nothing to do with Ukraine being unique. Georgia does the same thing with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and Serbia does the exact same thing with Kosovo. And I find that it's rather ironic that the very countries, the very people in Europe that are absolutely adamant about insisting on Ukraine's 1991 borders are the ones that have recognized Kosovo as an independent state and are telling Serbia as such, in order for you to get into the EU, you have to also give up on Kosovo. So there is, again, the biggest problem with liberalism is that it's selective. And so with that in mind, it seems like the talks in Geneva had collapsed. Ukrainian military officials are now saying, gear up and just dig in for another year or two of fighting. And as far as Russia is concerned, Putin has said, what we don't achieve in the negotiating room, we will achieve on the battlefield. Now, let's just say that they are able to take the rest of the territory within these 4 oblasts. What then? Because does Russia now have the leverage to say to Ukraine, okay, give up? Or do they need to go one step further? Do they need to make an attempt at taking Kharkov or Odessa, and then say, in return for us giving this back to Ukraine, you give us this, we'll give you that? I mean, this is ultimately how the concessions are going to be made. You can't get everything that you want if you don't control it already. And in order for you to get exactly what you want, you have to control a lot more as a way of giving up in order to keep what you have. I don't see any of this happening really anytime soon. And people are talking about Russia's economy now only surviving as a wartime economy. You mentioned before, Pascal, right, that one of the biggest problems in Europe is that if the war is over, the economies go back to peacetime. The United States, I don't know if you know about this, has been on a wartime economy since World War II. We have not gone back to that. And my guess is that in this day and age, a lot of countries are just going to find ways of staying on wartime economies. Money can be made, jobs can be given, and better yet, security is always the rhetoric to use when it's time for campaigning. And as long as Russia remains that threat, this is what the center left and center right are going to be saying, particularly in giving NATO some credibility for having a future.
Thank you. And Nicolai, what is it that you think should still be put out there?
We talk a lot about the international aspects of this conflict, and they are important. But in my own research, I've come to add to the picture the internal divisions within Ukraine, which have deep historical roots. And if those had not been allowed to fester, but had been healed earlier on, I doubt Ukrainian society would have succumbed to the temptation of dividing, and each side within it divided according to different cultural criteria, inviting its own advocates in to promote their interests against the other side. And this internal division opened the door very wide for the international conflict to step in and use Ukrainians to their advantage. So after the war, when the fighting stops, unfortunately, this internal division has not healed. It will still need to be addressed. And a lot of Ukrainian commentators that I read are very worried indeed about the immediate aftereffects of the war and the battles that will ensue afterwards against minorities and dissidents in Ukraine, which will tend to be swept under the rug in light of the ceasefire.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as sad as it is, but 4 years in, there's still no immediate end in sight, and the even the aftermath doesn't look very rosy. If it started now, and there's just one more thing I would like to add. The one thing that I think that the 4 years of Ukraine war did, like finally in the sense of like finishing it for good, is it finished the post-Cold War. Yeah. I think we were for 30 years in the post-Cold War kind of mind frame of being in the post-Cold War order, and that by now to me looks more like we are thinking of it as the
golden era.
The unipolar moment. The unipolar moment. The unipolar moment has definitely ended, and we are 4 years into the new thing. The question is, what is the new thing? Some people call it the second Cold War. Some people have started calling it the third, the phony phase of the Third World War. I wonder if we're going to remember it as the second 30-year war, just something long and drawn out. I hope not.
Or, for all of us who have read Antonio Gramsci, the global interregnum. How about that one? The old order is dying, the new has not yet formed, and in this crisis of authority, a number of morbid symptoms appear. One of my favorite lines in his essay, State and Civil Society. So perhaps. But yeah, I think that we are entering definitively the multipolar age. I also just want to finish up by saying, the United States under Trump, American foreign policy, and we can absolutely have a separate talk about this, is, I think, managed chaos. I think it's just organized haphazardness. It's just simply poke holes around the world and see what sticks. But the United States, I think, has recognized the end of this transatlantic alliance as well. They are staking out claims to be a regional power, especially in the Western Hemisphere, which may explain for their readiness to just acknowledge Russia has a sphere, China has a sphere. Unfortunately, Europe is kind of left within the cracks and crevices, still trying to keep this old order alive. And unfortunately, whether it's just simply because the rhetoric and the ideology is no longer there, or the leadership is pathetically mediocre. I mean, can any of you find anybody in Europe that you get some optimism from? I can't. I mean, for this current leadership, I just see them as just very much talking out of both sides of their mouth, but doing very little. And that's the world that we find ourselves in right now.
Unfortunately, yes. Nicolai, one more thing you want to add, or shall we wrap it up?
No, I'm fine. Thank you.
Then thank you very much, and everybody listening. I apologize that two of our guests couldn't join us. We must have had a misunderstanding when setting up this panel, but we will try to get them on a different time and catch up with everybody. At this point, Michael Rossi from Polsci and Nicolai Petro, University of Rhode Island. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.